Who is the better one with all of the heal juice though? Medic or MaRz? Now, I know there have been lots of great videos on this topic already. For example, I just watched one by Skymin whilst researching this video that was great and I found super useful, but I didn't find anyone who addressed the key question I have at the core of this video, and that is, who is sexier? I mean, who heals more? So I thought it would be interesting to make a video comparing the stats of these two iconic healers, and whenever we start off with a question like this, it always leads to an interesting discussion and I hope an interesting video. Of course, I could have picked many other famous video game healers such as Soraka from League of Legends or Lycan from Dota 2. They're my favourites. Never played those games in my life. But these two characters, I'm sure you'll agree, are particularly comparable because of their very similar heal mechanic, as well as the fact that they're both from similar class-based first-person shooters that are both dead, and I definitely don't play anymore because they're both completely dead, and I would never play dead games. I only play really kind of hyped up latest stuff like modern Apex Stranding 8. Two last things before we jump in. One, for the majority of this video, I'm going to be focusing on the stock loadout for Medic, and when I say stock, I mean the crossbow and the Uber Saw, because let's be honest, that is basically the stock. And two, there are timestamps down below if you want to jump to a certain part of the video. A single unit of health in one game will of course not necessarily be equal to a single unit of health in another game. So how do we measure the healing ability of two characters across two different games in a fair way? Well, there are multiple ways of doing this, each with their pros and cons. I made a video previously about the Sentry Gun versus the turret. It was a lot of fun and it had a great reception. In this video, I used what I was calling the baseline value, and what I meant by this was the health that the most amount of characters start with. For example, that was 125 HP in TF2 and 200 HP in Overwatch. So, with a little bit of mad math skills, we came to the ratio of 1 to 1.6, and I thought this was a decent way of doing things. But in that video, I also had a couple of great suggestions in the comments section as to other ways we can work this out. One suggestion was to compare the time to kill in each game. This I thought was super interesting, but we run into a few difficulties here. For example, what gun do we use to measure this? Because of course, if it was a model of a real world gun, the kind of thing you see in CSGO or COD, then we can kind of compare like for like. But when we're dealing with Farah's rocket launcher and Soldier's rocket launcher, they're about as close as it gets, but they're both from two different universes and they're completely fictional weapons. I did consider perhaps taking the time to kill for every single weapon in the game and then taking an average, but I think even that runs into some problems because that's quite a big range. So for example, we could take an insta-kill from a Widowmaker to the gradual tickle of Winston's Tesla cannon. You also have to consider what target you're using when measuring this, and of course the TTK could intentionally be different in each game, in which case the whole thing becomes somewhat meaningless. In conclusion, I wasn't sure of a good way of comparing them, so I decided to park this option, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in the comments below. I did actually find an interesting table that shows the TTK for Overwatch back from a few years ago, and this alone shows the breadth of the data you can get, and this is back when we had much fewer heroes in the game. But anyway, another suggestion that I received as a way to discern the kind of health point ratio for two games was to take the mean or average health of all the characters in the game and compare that figure. I was unsure about this at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I realised this might be a pretty decent way of doing this. And of course, to find the mean, you simply add all the items in a list together and divide it by the total number of items. So in our case, we have for TF2, 125 plus 125 plus 125 plus 1. You get the gist. Divided by 9 equals 166.667. And for Overwatch, we have 600 plus lots of other numbers, divided by 31 at the time of recording equals 287.1. So if we divide both sides by 166.7, we'll then have 1 on one side of the ratio and 1.72 on the other. I know some of you guys are super interested in the maths, so I do like to keep this kind of thing in for those who are interested. And for anyone who finds ratios a little bit difficult to understand, I know I do sometimes, I find it useful to kind of imagine it as a currency. And so in this case, that would mean that a single TF2 HP is kind of worth more, has more value than a single Overwatch health point. And this is pretty close to my original baseline ratio that I arrived at for my previous video, which was kind of reassuring. And so this seemed like a reasonable starting point for this video, and this is what I'm going to go ahead with and use for all my calculations. Okay, so let's get into the real meat of the video. Based on this ratio, these are the numbers we arrive at for MaRz and Medic. It turns out that Medic heals 24 HP per second, whereas MaRz heals a TF2 equivalent 29 HP per second. So there we have it, there's nothing else to it, no other factors to consider, no other nuances, abilities or weapons or anything like that worth mentioning. MaRz is better than Medic, and therefore Overwatch is better than TF2, and unfortunately now I'm going to have to uninstall TF2 and burn my computer. But hold your horses. You may have spotted some sarcasm. There is of course a lot more to it than these two figures. For starters, this is only how much Medic can heal in direct combat. For targets who have been out of combat for 10 seconds, this doubles to 48 HP per second and increases further to 72 HP per second after the target's been out of combat for 15 seconds. So now who heals more? And this mechanic is called crit healing or crit heals, and it's a massively important part of the Medic's gameplay that far too few people are familiar with. It's very useful to know this because it can be really useful in your gameplay. So the speed at which the Medic heals is very dynamic, whereas on the other hand, MaRz heals at a flat rate of 29 HP per second or 50 HP per second within the world of Overwatch. It's also worth briefly considering some of the other aspects of the way they heal. Both, once locked on, don't need to look at their target, but they do need to keep line of sight. With MaRz, my understanding is that there's a 1.4 second grace period where you can lose line of sight without the beam disconnecting, although it felt like more than that when I was testing it. And with Medic, I couldn't find a definitive number for this. It could supposedly be immediately, although it did feel again like there was some grace period, but if you know the answer to that, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. But let's move on to some other factors that I thought would be really interesting to compare. And before we jump in, a reminder that any calculations regarding distance or speed, I've converted hammer units from TF2 to meters or meters per second using this conversion. So, heals we've covered. HP, Medic wins over MaRz, he's slightly beefier. Speed while walking, again, Medic slightly wins over MaRz there. Range, and this means the range of their heal beam. MaRz has a much longer range here, and regen. Although the Medic's regen does gradually move up to 6 HP per second if he's been out of combat, the MaRz has much better regen, generally speaking. It's worth bearing in mind that Medic can connect to his target at 8.2 meters, but can disconnect at 10.1 meters. So there is a bit of leeway there, whereas MaRz has a flat 15 meters, as far as I understand it, for both connecting and disconnecting her beam. So Medic is faster and stronger, but MaRz heals more and can heal from further away and regens quicker. But let's be honest, to say that MaRz is quicker than Medic would be a bit of a crime, because at a click of a button, she can fly across the map using Guardian Angel, and it's at this point where abilities come into the equation and the whole thing gets a hell of a lot more complicated. But we'll get to abilities in just a moment. In case you're wondering, here are some average speeds for a walking, jogging and running human. So as you can see, Medic and MaRz are very speedy boys and girls. Good to know they're putting the effort in, running at a pretty decent pace there. Oh, and one more thing, if I was to use my original baseline ratio that I used in the previous video, it's worth noting that nothing really changes here, so it doesn't make a huge difference. But next up, we must compare a bunch of other things that are largely subjective, and to be honest, I'm probably going to be a tad biased, but I thought this would be good fun, and I think these are at least a bunch of great discussion points. But what I've done here is I've attached some arbitrary values based on my opinion, but I'd love to hear what you guys think and if you agree with me or disagree with me in the comments below. So first of all, their personality, well, they couldn't be much more different. I just recently watched the Meet the Medic video again, and it reminded me of why I love the Medic character so much.
No. Most hearts couldn't withstand this voltage. But I'm fairly certain your heart...
He's insane, he's a crazy genius, and he's absolutely hilarious. Whereas MaRz, she's sweet, she has this honourable character, but you could argue she's a tad bland. The visual design on the other hand, I would argue that both are awesome. You could even suggest that MaRz is slightly more iconic in terms of her silhouette, but I couldn't bring myself to have her win on this table. I've called it a draw there. Who's more difficult to play? Well, it's hard for me to say because I do have a bunch of hours on Medic, but I have about 12 minutes overall on MaRz. Although based on my research and my understanding, I get the impression that Medic is a little bit more difficult to learn because he doesn't have that mobility that MaRz has, and so positioning becomes even more important and slightly more unforgiving. But don't get me wrong, both have super high skill ceilings, although I think it's safe to say that generally speaking skill ceilings tend to be a bit higher in TF2. Oh dear God, what have I done? As for enjoyment, well, I'll leave that down to you. Both of their playstyles can be a little bit repetitive at times, but at least with Medic, you have loads of different weapons to choose from, and you can really mix it up if you want to. Oh, and of course, the most important factor, who has the most sexiness? But let's be honest, that goes without saying. I mean, do I need to say any more? Do I need to say any more? Do I really need to say any more? Do I need to? Oh dear God. Okay, so let's finish up by briefly taking a look at some of the more important abilities that these two characters have. And when we start to consider these abilities and the other weapons that the Medic has, this is where it very quickly becomes practically impossible to compare the two characters. But just for fun, I thought I'd list them out here, and I've kind of added an impact value for each ability based on my opinion that again I'd love to get your feedback on. I won't spend too long on this because you could kind of talk about this forever, but just briefly, there are some parallels between some of these. For example, the Ubercharge versus the Valkyrie, both special abilities that you build up to. I would argue that Medic's Ubercharge is slightly more game changing in that it's the only thing of its kind in the game, whereas in Overwatch there are Qs being pressed all over the gaff. But with the Ubercharge, you really can break holds or you can initiate pushes. The Medic's heal buffs is something we haven't really talked about yet, but they're a hugely important part of his gameplay. In Overwatch, you only really get buffs from ultimates, with a few exceptions, whereas the Medic, he can just buff anyone he likes to 150% of their original health, and it completely changes how that class can perform. Although, on the other hand, you have the Resurrection, another completely game-changing ability. One of the best abilities in the game, potentially. Medic has his long-range heals from his crossbow. So much fun to use, I think, although in reality you're probably meant to only use that 5 to 10% of the time. The Guardian Angel for the Mercy, again super important, means that she's so much more survivable and more enjoyable to play, and I would say this is probably more comparable to the whole matching the speed of your target that the Medic has, but I just wanted to put these in order of kind of their impact, and I think matching the speed of your target, it's a nice addition. It came surprisingly late into the game, but it doesn't change too much in terms of how the Medic plays, except of course when you're rolling out to mid. And finally, the damage amp. I'm sure that's a big deal if you play Mercy. I'll be honest, I don't have enough experience to talk about this. I don't use it much, so it felt like it was less important. You're probably going to shout at me for that, but you know, correct me if I'm wrong. I probably am. And finally, Angelic Descent kind of goes hand in hand with Guardian Angel, but I decided to put it at the bottom of the list there because it felt slightly less valuable than some of the other items. So there we have it, Medic versus Mercy, the insane genius versus the honourable doctor. Who's the bestest? Well, luckily, there's enough room in my heart for both of them, especially Sexy Medic. But how does this change how I feel about these two iconic healers? Well, I would say that Mercy seems to be a super mobile and agile healer, whereas Medic is a little bit slower, a little bit tougher, and could probably defend himself a bit better in a 1v1, especially using melee, which we haven't really talked about today. You also have to remember that Mercy is one of many healers. She's a very reliable and solid choice, but there are often fluctuations in the meta, which means that sometimes there'll be better options available. Whereas Medic, as the only healer in the game, he's always a welcome sight to behold, and always a vital member of any TF2 team. Both are pretty bad at dealing damage at range, and both are pretty vulnerable in one-on-ones, being the lowest damage dealers in each game. And although Mercy has more abilities up her sleeve, the Medic has an abundance of weapons that will keep his gameplay varied and interesting for all those Medic mains who continue to enjoy the class. There's so much more we could have gone into today, such as the various weapons, team compositions, and so on and so forth, but I hope you enjoyed, and as I said before, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
Oh man, you would not believe how much this hurts.
Archimedes?